Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Connolly. I am a member of our education department here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, located in Long Beach, California. Now, today during our program, we are actually coming at you live from the Aquarium of the Pacific, like I said, here in Long Beach. And it is 10 a.m. Pacific time on Tuesday, June 10th. So if you're watching along at that time, please feel free to join us during this program and interact with us. We love to hear from you. We've got a couple of options for you. So the first thing is if you're watching live with us, you can text into that top number on the screen, which is 562 286 1838. Now, if you're watching at another time and you still have some things you'd like to share, we're always happy to hear those from you. We just ask that you use that bottom email right there, which is going to be live@lbaop.org, and shoot us an email to send us your question or your observation or anything like that. And someone from our team will get back to you to answer your question or thank you for sharing with us. So today in the studio, I am also not alone. I am joined by my friends Lourdes and Jeanette, and they're going to be controlling all of this magic you see happening behind me as we go on a tour of some of our ocean habitats, as well as monitoring that text and email line so that if you want to talk with us, we'll get to hear what you're saying. And in real time, you can ask questions and tell us something you want to learn about. It's pretty cool. We love to hear from you. I really encourage you to share with us. All right, so like I said, today we're going to be learning about some different ocean habitats. And I want to start by thinking a little bit about what it even means that there are these things we call habitats, right? So we can put that word up here on the screen, habitat. And have you heard this word before? Hmm. Yeah, so a habitat is exactly just like a home for an animal, right? So it's just where these animals are living, right? Maybe you have somewhere that you're living, right? In a house or an apartment or something like that. That's kind of like your habitat, right? But our animals have a habitat that's also a place that they're living. So right now we're looking at a habitat that we call blue cavern. It's a kelp forest habitat. So there's many different kinds of habitats, right? Just like all people's homes might look a little different, right? Animals' homes can look different too. There's different types of habitats. So we're starting today by looking at one called, like I said, the kelp forest. And right now what you're seeing behind me is one of our webcams. So a really cool thing that we actually have here at the Aquarium of the Pacific is we have live views of quite a few of our exhibits. And if you're wondering at home what any of our animals are up to, you can just head on our website and pull up a webcam and see what's going on. So for example, right now, let me move off the screen so we can see what's going on here. We are looking at our blue cavern exhibit, like I mentioned, which is based on a real blue cavern dive site, kind of off the coast of California here near Catalina Island. And we can see this beautiful kelp forest habitat. So I want us to warm our brains up a little bit. We're going to be kind of thinking like scientists today. I mentioned earlier, right? We're going to be making observations and asking questions and things like that. So let's kind of practice that skill first of all here in our kelp forest. I want us to use our eyeballs to notice things, right? To make an observation. An observation can be as simple as a color you're seeing, or an animal like this big fish that's coming up to the camera to say hi. That's our giant sea bass. Or it could be a behavior you're noticing, right? Like these fish swimming by. It could be a shape you're seeing, a plant, something that's not alive that's in the habitat too, right? These are all things we can notice that are really important to observe, right? To notice, to kind of figure out what the heck is going on in this habitat. So observations are just anything that we're seeing here. So I noticed, of course, we saw that big fish friend swimming by, but I see also maybe lots of other small fish in here that all seem to be swimming around. I'm noticing there are some really big rocks at the bottom of this exhibit here. I'm noticing something that kind of looks like a plant, this kind of greenish, brownish stuff, right? That's our kelp. So I'm seeing that in this habitat. Another thing that sometimes we forget to mention that's kind of the most important observation of them all when we're talking about the ocean is that we're underwater, right? So this camera is actually kind of in the bottom of the exhibit here, and we're getting to see this like underwater point of view, just like you would if you were at the aquarium and you could kind of see through the glass or the acrylic into this underwater ocean habitat. So we've kind of warmed up our brain by making some of these observations. Now, I want us to chat in a little more detail about the kelp forest itself, right? So we've noticed a few things about it, But I want to start by talking about the thing that we hear in the name of the kelp forest, which is the kelp, right? And the second word, forest, means the same thing that when you think of a forest on land, right? And on a forest on land, what is that made up of? Yeah, trees, right? So we have big trees that get really tall and make a huge forest for all sorts of creatures to live in. Well, we have the same thing in the ocean. We have forests like this, but instead of being made up of trees, they are made up of all of this beautiful kelp. So that was one of those things that I was noticing. You probably also noticed, right? We have all this kelp here. Now, our kelp kind of looks like a plant and it works kind of similarly. It provides a similar function, but it's actually what we call an algae. So it's a little bit different than a plant, but it kind of does some of those same things. So, one of the things that is really important that our kelp does is that it does photosynthesis. Now, that's just a big word that means that this organism here, this algae, right, does the same thing that plants on land do, where instead of getting their energy by eating something like you or I would have to do, right, eat a meal to give us some energy in our body, instead, these things can do a really cool thing where they take light from the sun, they absorb that inside of them, and then they make energy that way. So they're actually not eating anything, right? They are just absorbing that energy from the sun, from that outside source, and they use photosynthesis where that's what converts that sunlight into the energy for them to use, right? To stay alive, to grow. So just like we would get our energy from eating a meal, they are getting their energy from the sun. And as a result of doing photosynthesis, one of the products of that reaction, or one of the things that it creates, is oxygen. Now, you might have heard that word before because it's really important for animals that live on land, like us as humans, right? Or maybe your pets, right? If you have like a dog or a cat or even reptiles, things like that, right? So it's really important that we have oxygen. That's what we're breathing in, right? We can all take a deep breath together like that, and we were breathing in that oxygen. That's what we need to help keep us alive. So we can thank plants or algae like our kelp for providing us with that oxygen, right, to help us to live and to breathe every single day. So our kelp, like I said, is kind of like a plant, but it looks a little different. And I have a model here that I'm going to grab so we can kind of look a little closer at how our kelp works. So one of the things I'm noticing about the kelp is that it grows up from these rocks, right? So instead of having roots that grow down into soil like a plant, our kelp has what we call a holdfast. And it's basically, it looks almost like a big pile of spaghetti. It's all of these little, they kind of look like roots, but they're holding onto the rock instead, kind of like that. So they're just kind of sitting on top and grabbing on that way. And then, where does our kelp grow from there? If we look at maybe like this one here, we can see the holdfast right there. And then where's our kelp going? Does it go down? Does it go kind of to the side? No, it kind of grows straight up, right? Towards that sunlight that provides it with that energy. And there are some different parts of the kelp that help it to do that, right? So I have my model here of some kelp, and we'll notice that in the center of it, we have kind of like a stem, right? Just like we would have with a plant on land. Let's go to my document camera so we can take kind of a better look here at our kelp because it gets a little messed up with our green screen. So in our document camera over here, we can see kind of a better look at that kelp, right? So here in the middle, we can kind of see that stem looking thing, right? Now on kelp, we call this a stipe. And it serves the same function kind of as the stem, right? It's kind of the central part that the kelp is growing up from. And then attached to the stipe, we kind of get these little offshoots, almost like branches, right? And that's where we get kind of this main, really big part of the kelp here. Now, there are two parts here that I want to talk about. The first one is we have these kind of little round looking things here, right? They're actually filled with air. They're called nematocysts. And they help that kelp to grow upwards, right? So we notice that the kelp wants to grow towards the surface of the water to absorb that sunlight. And these things are kind of like a little life jacket, right? If you've ever gone swimming and sat in like a tube filled with air or worn a life jacket, right? That helps you to float, to be buoyant. Well, this is like our kelp's little life jacket to help it float up towards the surface and grow straight up towards that sun. And then attached to that little air sac, that pneumaticist, we have what looks like a leaf. Now, on our kelp, we call this a blade. And this is actually the part of the kelp that's going to be taking in that sunlight and doing that photosynthesis, right? So that's what allows the kelp to make that energy. And that's why they are so big and have so much surface area, right? Meaning they have a lot of space on them to take in all of that sunlight and also to absorb things through the water, right? So because our kelp doesn't have roots to absorb nutrients like a plant on land would, they're doing that through the blade. So the blade is nice and big, it has lots of space for it to take in sunlight and all those other nutrients from the water that our kelp needs to help it grow. All right, so now that we've learned a little bit about what our kelp looks like, we're going to talk about some of the animals that we can find there. But let's head back into our kelp forest first so we can kind of remind ourselves of what it looks like when all of that kelp is growing. So we can see our kelp's growing straight up with the help of those pneumatists. We can see it kind of swaying through the water. We can see those big, beautiful blades, right? Taking in that sunlight, taking in all those nutrients from the water to help our kelp grow nice and big. And our kelp can actually, under the right conditions, it can grow about 2 feet per day. That's pretty big, right? Our kelp can get super, super tall in our kelp forest. So you can see how a habitat like this would provide lots of space for other animals to live, right? It's pretty cool that the habitat is actually made up of something that itself is alive, right? It's not just like rocks and sand and things that aren't alive for animals to live in, but there's a living creature that's providing the home. Now, have we ever seen any animals that might be living in our kelp forest? I think we have a pretty cool video that might show some of our friends kind of swimming around in the kelp forest that can kind of give us a clue of some creatures we might find there. Do you see some animals swimming around here? Ooh, one just came right by the camera. Now, do you know what this animal is called? Yeah, these are California sea lions. Now, you might have said seal, and a seal is a very similar kind of animal, right? They're called pinnipeds because they both kind of are similar looking animals and they kind of move around in a similar way, right? But these are our sea lions. And the way that I could tell that was there's a couple of ways that we can tell. So I think if we're able to, we might be able to pull up kind of 2 pictures, perfect, of our sea lion next to our seal. So we can kind of do a little compare and contrast and see how we can tell these 2 animals apart. So the one on the left is the California sea lion, right? That animal that we were just looking at. And what I notice about our California sea lion, first of all, compared to the seal, is the color, right? Our California sea lions here on the left are this beautiful brown, kind of chocolatey color, right? They're kind of all one color, and they're that kind of darkish brown. Whereas our harbor seals, our friend right over here, look at that cute little face, they are kind of like a speckled, spotted pattern, right? And they're more black and white. We usually like to say here at the aquarium, they're kind of cookies and cream, whereas our sea lions are like a chocolate, right? If we're thinking about ice cream. So we can definitely tell from that color that those animals in that first video were sea lions. They had that brown body instead of that black and white kind of spotted. There's actually one other way that we can tell. It's a little bit more subtle. It's not as easy to see. But if we look at the side of the head on these animals, can you spot a difference between them? Think about what we have on the sides of our heads. Ears, right? So if we look at the ears of these 2 animals, you'll notice that on our California sea lion, we can see these cute little ear flaps, right? These kind of little triangles right on the side of their head, just like we have external ears, right, that stick out from our head. So do our California sea lions. But if we look at our harbor seals, well, they look a little bit different, right? They don't have that external ear flap, that ear on the outside of their body. They just have a little opening for their ear on the side right there. You can kind of see just a little opening there. They have one on each side, so they don't have ears sticking out like us or our sea lions, right? So that's another way that we can tell the difference between the seals and the sea lions. Now, I want to talk about one more animal in our kelp forest before we kind of switch gears and think about a different habitat. But I want to talk about an animal that doesn't have any bones in its body. Because we have bones, right? And these animals behind me definitely have bones to help them move around. But some animals don't have those. And one of the animals in the kelp forest that doesn't have any bones actually loves to eat kelp. Do you have a guess at what it might be? We have a picture of it right up here. Have you seen this animal before? Yeah, it's a sea urchin, right? The one here specifically is a purple sea urchin because it has that beautiful purple color. And we can see here it is sitting on top of its favorite food, right? That kelp. We're getting a great look here at the blade of the kelp and that little air sac, the nematocyst, right? Just we're seeing on the model. So our sea urchins love to eat kelp. And if we're looking at it here, we see all of those spikes. Why do you think our urchin might be spiky? That would be a good adaptation to have, right? A good thing to have on your body to help you survive. Yeah, for protection, right? So if you're a really spiky animal like this, if you saw this, would you want to bite into that? No, right? It looks like it would probably hurt your mouth. So they have those spines to help protect them, right? To make sure that it kind of keeps them from getting eaten by other things. But they have a mouth as well to help them eat the kelp. Do you think you see their mouth in this picture? Well, I don't really see anything up here that looks like their mouth, but we can kind of get a clue from this picture. Because where is the kelp in relation to the urchin? Oh, it's underneath it, right? So maybe the mouth of our sea urchin is on the bottom, right? Maybe our sea urchin's actually eating this kelp right now, and we just can't see their mouth. And indeed, that is where the mouth of the sea urchin is. It is located right on the underside in the middle. They have a little mouth there that helps them to kind of scrape at the algae to take kind of some little bites of the kelp there and eat it that way, right? Because this is kind of a smaller animal compared to how big our kelp can get. So they're scraping away at it to take some little bites that way. All right, so we've learned about our kelp forest habitat. We've met a few of the creatures that live in it. And now we're going to look at a totally different ocean habitat. So maybe let's head back to our kelp forest first, just for a second, to remind ourselves of what that habitat looked like and get ourselves ready to kind of compare it. Something that we do in science a lot is looking at two things and seeing how they're similar, how they're the same, and how they're different, right? So we call that kind of comparing and contrasting. So we're seeing our kelp forest here. The kelp is growing upwards. It's very greenish, kind of brownish in color, not super, super colorful. And the animals that are living there, right, are kind of blending in with that. All right, perfect. So now let's look at another habitat we have in the ocean. It's called a coral reef. We're getting a great look at our coral reef here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. This is our tropical reef. And again, we're looking at another webcam here. This is a live view of that exhibit. Now, in our coral reef habitat here, we can see it looks totally different, right? Do you see any kelp in this habitat? No, I don't see any, right? So our habitat here is made up of something different than the kelp. What do you think this habitat is made up of? The name might give us a clue, right? Just like the kelp forest told us it was made of kelp. What do you think the coral reef is made up of? Yeah, it's made up of coral, right? So we can see in the background here all of these kind of weird rock-looking things, but they're a little bit more colorful or maybe a little more kind of weirdly, oddly shaped, right? That is actually coral. And just like kelp is actually a live organism that makes up the kelp forest, coral is actually alive too that makes up the coral reef. Now, it kind of looks like a rock or a weird kind of thing there, but it's actually an animal. So, in our coral reef, there are a few different parts of the coral that make it up into that animal. But I want to kind of first do some observing here about how this looks different than our kelp forest, right? So what are we seeing here? Does it look more colorful or less colorful than the kelp forest? Yeah, definitely more colorful, right? It's hard to see sometimes from the water kind of, obscuring it, making it a little harder to see, but the coral is actually super, super colorful. We might have a clip here, perfect, of a more colorful, a little better, closer look at that coral where we can see all of those colors, right? What else are you noticing about the coral reef compared to the kelp forest? Yeah, I'm definitely seeing colorful fish as well, right? And that kind of makes sense. If we think about animals want to kind of blend in or camouflage with their habitat. So the sea lions were that brown color to blend in with the kelp, And the seals had that kind of spotted color to help them also camouflage in a different way with the kelp forest habitat. So our animals here are super brightly colored to help them blend in with the super colorful coral. Now, let's talk a little more about the coral itself. Because I mentioned that it's an animal, but it looks really different, right? We don't really see it moving, we don't really see it eating or anything like that. And it looks just like a rock. If you didn't know any better, right, you would totally assume maybe it's just a really colorful, kind of different looking rock. But our coral is actually an animal, and it's kind of made up of two different parts. So the corals are all made up of what we call a coral polyp. And it kind of looks like a little sea anemone. Here's a great picture here of a bunch of coral polyps, right? So we would say that this whole thing all together is that coral that we saw in the video. But each one of these individual little, almost tree looking things, right, or flower looking things, is a polyp. And the polyp is the little animal, right, that makes up the coral. And they're kind of sitting there like this. And they have these tentacles on the end, like we noticed, that kind of look like a flower. And ooh, here we can see them kind of in action moving, right? And those tentacles, just like a jelly or an anemone, because they're a similar animal, they actually have some stinging cells on them. So our corals can actually sting some prey as it moves by. Now, our polyps are really, really small, right? We kind of zoomed in these videos here to see them, but when we were looking at that coral reef habitat, you can't see the individual polyps. So do you think the food they're eating is big or small? Yeah, it's pretty small, right? They're usually grabbing some little plankton that might be drifting by in the water, and they can eat their food that way. But they can also get their energy another way, and it's the same way that we mentioned earlier with our kelp. Do you remember what that word was called when something uses sunlight to make its energy? Yeah, photosynthesis, right? So believe it or not, an animal like this can actually get energy from the sun as well. But they do kind of a shortcut or maybe like a little hack, right? And they're not actually doing the photosynthesis themselves, the polyps aren't. But they have a friend that lives inside them that they kind of coexist with. And that is what allows them to get energy from the sun. So inside of the coral polyps, there is an algae called zooxanthellae. Now, I think we have that word we can put up. It's kind of a weird word. But just like we mentioned that kelp is an algae, right? We have a really small algae called a microalgae that is living inside of those polyps. And it's doing the exact same thing that the kelp was doing, right? So it's getting light from the sun, taking it inside of it, and converting that into energy. And because that algae is living inside of our polyps, we might have a picture of that. If not, that's cool too. But because it's living inside of the polyp, right, it's giving it a home, they're actually giving some of that energy back to the coral polyp. So during the daytime, when our algae can get light from the sun, right, and photosynthesize, our coral can get energy that way. But then at night, is there any sun around still? No, there's not, right? So you can't do photosynthesis at night when there's no sunlight to take in and make energy with. But our corals can still get energy that other way, right? By using those tentacles to grab some little plankton that might be in the water and eat it that way. So the coral polyp and the algae have this really cool relationship where they help each other out, right? The coral gives the zooxanthellae a home, and then the zooxanthellae gives the coral some energy as a nice little thank you. So it's pretty cool that these two things that are both alive can kind of coexist and help each other out. So if we head over to my document camera, I have what we call a coral skeleton. And I want us to chat a little bit about what this looks like, right? So now I said it's called a coral skeleton, but it's not a true skeleton like you or I might have, right? Because coral, like an urchin, does not have any bones in its body. We call that an invertebrate. But they can make this kind of hard, exterior of their body. And when they're growing, all of those polyps kind of make a little hard place for the zooxanthellae to live in, right? So we can look in and see all of these kind of little dots. Let me get a nice zoomed in look here. And you can see where a little coral polyp used to live, right? And what happens is when the zooxanthellae leaves the coral, right, if the water gets too warm or it's not a good environment, right, if the coral's not doing well, it might expel the zooxanthellae because it takes some energy, right, for the coral to give them a home. So sometimes they kind of kick out the zooxanthellae, But then the coral doesn't do very well, right? Because we mentioned that the coral is getting its energy from that algae, from that zooxanthellae. And then sometimes our coral will actually kind of reach the end of its life and we'll have these coral skeletons will get made. And if you've ever heard the word coral bleaching, right, that's exactly what's happening because when that zooxanthellae leaves, that's what gives the coral its beautiful colors. And without it, we only have this very boring kind of white skeleton left behind. So that's why it's really important, right, that by preserving our coral reef habitats, we can allow for the coral to keep living with that zooxanthellae and create those beautiful coral reefs that give those animals a home. So now that we've learned about our coral, I want to touch on one creature that we can find in there really quick, and that's one of our beautiful, brightly colored fish called the parrotfish. Now, the parrotfish is really cool because we just talked all about how the coral has that hard skeleton and it kind of protects it and gives it a home. And it looks like a rock, right? It doesn't really look like a food you would easily be able to bite into and eat as your, source of food. But our parrotfish here said, that doesn't seem like a problem for me. And they have this cool adaptation where their mouth is actually kind of like a beak. So I wonder if we can see maybe a different angle or different picture here, perfect, of our parrotfish. And look at that mouth. That is kind of a weird looking mouth, right? That's a super unique adaptation that they have this beak and these hard parts on it that allow them to actually take a bite of that coral, right? Just crunch a bite of that coral right off, kind of chomp it up, and they swallow everything. Now, what they actually are after, right, is that inside part of the coral, not the hard skeleton, but the stuff inside that actually has the nutrients, right, the animal that's living in it. But they just take a whole bite of it all, crunch it up, and digest it. And then when their waste comes out the other end, it's actually sand. And it's actually that white sand, right? Just like we saw the skeleton of the coral is kind of that very white color. Well, our parrotfish are actually creating white sand. So if you've ever been to a white sand beach, you might have actually been walking along on some parrotfish poop. But it's pretty cool because that's definitely not something I would want to take a bite of, right? The coral doesn't look like a good snack to me, but the parrotfish says, no problem, that seems great for me to eat. All right, my friends, so we've kind of gotten to compare two different ocean habitats. Let's head back to our coral reef habitat here and get one last look at that beautiful vibrancy that we see here. We see all of these super colorful fish. I noticed that the parrotfish was also super brightly colored, right? Because it's blending in with the coral reef. And remember that that beautiful color from the coral is coming from that zooxanthellae. That algae that lives inside the coral gives it some energy and gives it that super bright colors. And that's why it's really important that we want to help our ocean habitats, especially like our coral reef, where we're actually losing a lot of our coral, right? As the ocean gets warmer, it's not a good place for the zooxanthellae to live, and the coral don't really like that warming ocean temperature, so they'll get rid of them, and then we lose all of this biodiversity, meaning all these animals living here in the coral reef, because the coral reef kind of dies, right? It's no longer this beautiful, vibrant habitat, but instead just kind of a, little remains of what it used to be, and we just see those kind of bleached coral reefs without all this amazing animals living inside of it. So we saw our coral reef here with those coral polyps that make it up and give the home, these beautiful fish that are super colorful living inside of it. And we talked about how it's a little bit different than our kelp forest, right? Instead of an algae, which is kind of like a plant making up the habitat, we have an animal, right? So this is actually an animal, but it does still have that algae inside of it, the zooxanthellae. We're seeing some different types of fish here instead of seals and sea lions or our urchins, right? We're seeing maybe anemones and corals and some beautiful tropical fish like that. And we got to learn about how, even though these habitats are different, they've got lots of similarities in that all the animals living there are adapted to live in that habitat, right? So they have features that allow them to live in this habitat that maybe wouldn't make them successful in a kelp forest, or vice versa, right? If we took our brown sea lion and put it here in the beautiful coral reef, it wouldn't do so well. So animals are adapted to live in the habitat that they are living in. And let's take one last look here at our kelp forest. Beautiful. So that's going to bring us to the end of our program today, but I want to say thank you so much for joining me and learning about our different ocean habitats. We talked about just two of them today, our kelp forest and our coral reef, but there are so many more for you to explore. And if you're interested in that, I encourage you to watch some of our other aquarium online academies, do your own research, read books, look things up online. The ocean is such an amazing place, and there are so many amazing habitats outside of the two that we talked about today. Remember, if you have any other questions, you are free to email us at live@lbaop.org. We would always love to hear those from you. All right. Other than that, thank you so much for joining me today, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Bye.